Shabbat Shalom. We read Parshat Ki Tisa this Shabbat in Shul, and it's with special resonance that we return to Parshat Ki Tisa this year because we skipped Parshat Ki Tisa last year. We closed our Shul in the afternoon, Friday afternoon, Erev Shabbat of Parshat Ki Tisa on March 13th, and we kept our Shul closed, as you probably remember, for another 3 months. And so it's really with a lot of emotion that I am contemplating hearing Parashat Ki Tisa read again in our shul for the first time in 2 years. Normally when we hear a parasha, it's only been a year since we've heard it read, and this year it's 2 years. And I want to share with you some additional resonances that this parasha has for me, specifically this year in the aftermath of having skipped it last spring when our shul was closed. Parshat Ki Tisa contains the Torah's account of the worship of the golden calf and Moshe's shattering of the tablets of the law. And one of the most famous and significant and influential to me understandings of Moshe's choice to shatter the tablets comes from the Meshech Chachma, a commentary in the Torah, an early modern commentary in the Torah by Meir Simcha of Dvinsk. And he writes that all sanctity, all holiness comes from God and from our proximity to God through obedience to God's law. And every other holiness, holy item, holy concept in the Torah is derivative holiness. The holiness of Israel, the holiness of Jerusalem, the holiness of the temple and the objects of the temple. All of that holiness is derivative. It's depends upon the Torah itself and an obedience to the Torah. In the absence of obedience to the Torah, that holiness is worthless. And the same, he goes on to write, that's true. Every human being ultimately is equal, and our status and our significance is really only dependent on our obedience to the mitzvot of the Torah. And that's true of the highest of the high and the lowest of the low. If they violate a mitzvah, they're punished in exactly the same way. They're all equally accountable to the Torah. And so when Moshe came down the mountain and saw that the people had panicked in Moshe's absence and had violated a rule, a mitzvah, just given to them days earlier, and built for them an idolatrous golden cow, Moshe shattered the luchot because he realized there was a twofold mistake that the people had made. The first is they had thought that Moshe himself was more important than he really was. Moshe was just an intermediary to deliver the Torah. But if Moshe hadn't returned from the mountain, the Torah would have been the same. It would have endured. They would have been equally obligated and accountable to the mitzvot of the Torah, even in Moshe's absence. The Israelites panicking in Moshe's absence indicated to Moshe that his own role in Jewish life was misunderstood by his students. They thought he was more important and more crucial than he truly was. And furthermore, in their ability to worship the calf, Moshe realized that their distance from idolatry and from endowing physical objects with imagined holiness, that they really had not progressed all that much from the idolatry that they had left behind in Egypt. And Moshe understood that had he delivered these tablets inscribed with the hand of God to such a idol-inclined population, they would have abandoned the golden calf, but they would have replaced it with the worship of the tablets. So this year, I'm reminded of that truth, okay? That what's really important, what sustains Judaism, what sustains the world and all creation is the Torah and our obedience to the Torah. And things that are indeed sacred, that were core parts of our identity and of our lifestyle as Jews, like coming to shul and having, Shabbos guests and Yontif guests, okay? All of those things that are truly holy insofar as they are mitzvot of the Torah and sustain Jewish life. They're only holy insofar as they are mitzvot of the Torah. They're not essentially holy. And sometimes, most of the time, the Torah tells us, come to shul, have lots of guests over at your home for Shabbos and Yontif meals. And sometimes the Torah says, stay away from shul. Don't have guests over in your house. That's what the Torah said to us last spring. And I think we have a better sense this year than we did last year of what's truly essential and what is what we can pause for a few months, or even more than a few months, and then return to when it's safe to do so. I think we understand, right? The synagogue is holy, but it's really holy because most of the time the Torah tells us to come to synagogue. But when the Torah tells us stay away from synagogue to protect your lives and protect the lives of those even more vulnerable than you, then coming to the synagogue is no longer a holy action. Okay, that's the message of Parsha Ki Tisa, very resonant to me, specifically this year. Finally, the end of the parasha, the Torah describes Moshe returning down with the second set of luchot, the second set of tablets, and the Torah says that Moshe's face was radiant, it was shining. And the Orach Chaim HaKadosh, an early modern, earlier than the Meshech Chachma, commentary on the Torah, writes that the source of Moshe's radiance, quoting a midrashic tradition, was a little bit of leftover ink that remained on the quill after Moshe had dictated the Torah. And where was that extra ink, right? Surely God didn't give Moshe, not enough ink or too much ink. Shouldn't there have been exactly enough ink in Moshe's inkwell, if you will, to dictate the Torah perfectly? So he suggests that when in the book of Numbers, the Torah describes Moshe as being the most humble of all people, as Moshe's transcribing that praise of himself, dictating God's words, writing about himself in the third person, Moshe couldn't brag about his own humility, okay? It's, right? That's a very hard thing to do. And so Moshe left out the yud in the word anav. He kind of minimized the amount of ink that he had to deploy to describe his own modesty when he dictated the Torah. And that was the source of the extra ink that let his face to shine. And I think we've learned a lot about modesty. Modesty is about withdrawal. It's about making less space in the world because you recognize the existence of other people and we have to make room for them in the world. And that's what we did this past year when we closed our shul. That's what we're still doing when we're refraining from the sorts of social interactions that we're used to, that we'd really love to jump back into. That's modesty. We're refraining, we're holding back, we're limiting our actions in the world, we're limiting our impact on the world to make space for others in more vulnerable medical situations, okay? To make space for others we don't even know about, the chain of the chain of the chain, that a viral transmission could put somebody in great, great danger. That's modesty, that's humility. And Parsha Ki Tisa shows us that acts of humility, okay, ultimately lead to tremendous radiance. It's a beautiful thing. It's a source of real splendor when we are able to hold back and pull in. And we've done that this year. And please God, the radiance that we've earned will shine, will be visible to others, will be a source of inspiration to ourselves as slowly, with the guidance of physicians, we see each other more frequently, in greater numbers, in good health, please God, in the coming weeks and in the coming months. I wish you all a Shabbat Shalom.